Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church into the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Now, here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Lauren Richmond Jr., and this is the first of a special 3-episode run hosted by Reverend Martha Tatarnic. This first episode features Amy Frykholm. Amy is a senior editor at the Christian Century magazine. Her most recent book is Wild Woman, A Footnote, The Desert, and My Quest for an Elusive Saint. She hosts the In Search Of podcast and can be found at amyfrykholm.com.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. I am your host this week, Martha Tatarnic, and today I am joined by Dr. Amy Frykholm for a conversation about journalism, podcasting, and how these various media platforms can serve the church. Welcome, Amy. It is so great to have you on the Future Christian Podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me, Martha.
Okay, well, what would you like to share about yourself and just kind of the Cole's notes of your faith journey to this point?
Yeah, so I grew up in South Dakota, in Sioux Falls, which is a kind of middle-sized city on the far east of that state. And my dad was a Presbyterian minister.
Okay.
And he also was a professor of Greek and New Testament at a small Baptist college. And so as the years went by, I eventually became a Baptist because he became a seminary professor in the North American Baptist Seminary. And that required the family to go to this Baptist church, which, to be honest, my parents were not very happy there. But for whatever weird reason, I just loved it. I think the boys were cuter or something, or I don't know, but whatever it was, it just worked for me.
That's a good draw, I guess.
Yeah, it worked for me in those days. It was just like, oh, and so I spent my adolescent years in a pretty conservative evangelical environment. I'm not sure I had either of those words to describe my own perceptions of things or what I was doing there, but I think that they were pretty accurate. And then I went to a Lutheran college. I went to St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota. I didn't really know what a Lutheran was. And as we were driving to the college, my dad said, so, they have this thing, it's called liturgy, and I think you're really going to like it. And so that was my introduction to Lutheranism. So I spent 4 years hanging out with the Lutherans and the Quakers in Northfield, Minnesota.
And was your dad right? Did you like this thing called liturgy?
I did like it. I liked it a lot. Yeah, I didn't understand, really what everyone was doing and why it mattered to them so much, but it was so beautiful. And so I just started to appreciate the beauty and the ritual. And then that was contrasted with my attraction to the Quakers, which were also very beautiful, but sort of the opposite. So I sort of held both of those things through college. And then I just went into, I think, what's pretty common in our culture, but just a very long desert period where I really didn't see very much in religion that I wanted for myself. I think I was sort of purifying a lot of the things that had been going on there, maybe a lot of self-righteousness, for example, that just needed to go, but had to take kind of a long period to exit. So then I moved to the mountains of Colorado. And I planned to stay only 1 year. And I just kind of have this weird thing, which is anywhere I've lived, I've always tried to figure out where they're serving free food. And then I go and I attach myself to that place.
Is that right?
And so, yeah, that's kind of like my most foundational spiritual practice is like free food. And so there was this little place called St. George Episcopal Church, and I walked over one day and started cooking the community meal. And I've been cooking the community meal there ever since. So this is 23 years.
And you said that you just you were just cooking that meal right before coming on the podcast, right?
Yeah, I just did it right before coming on the show. I just did it. So that was a long time ago, 23 years ago. And I wasn't really, again, interested in church. And I wasn't really sure that I wanted to know very much about what was going on behind those, glass doors or whatever. But then my parents came for Christmas, my first year in Leadville. And I figured they'd probably want to go to church somewhere. And so I thought I'd better check out this church that I'd been cooking the meal at and just see if, maybe that would be a good place for us to go on Christmas Eve. So I went and I sat in the back, and there were 4 total people in the church that day. I thought I would sit in the back, but I mean, when there's only 4 people, it's kind of hard.
You're a bit exposed.
And yeah, I've been exposed. So I walked in, and the pastor said, well, we're small. And I was like, oh, okay, great. I think 2 of the people who were there were named Bill. And that's just how weird it was. So I sat there and we did morning prayer, and I just started to weep.
Wow.
And that continued for quite some time, where I would show up for prayer and I would weep. And I just realized how hungry I was, how long that desert had been, and how very little spiritual nourishment there had been for me over those years. And so I started to attend this church. I didn't think I wanted to become an Episcopalian. That whole thing just seemed very kind of freakish to me, the way people join churches, and like, do we really have to do that? Can I just show up for the rest of my life and, I don't have to sign some paper, or I don't know. I was very anxious about that. But the pastor, who was becoming one of my very closest friends, asked me if I'd serve on the leadership committee. And it became a little bit weird to serve on the leadership committee at this very tiny church, but also not be an Episcopalian.
I see, yeah.
So at some point I was like, okay, sure, let's do that. What is that thing you guys do? And so I went through confirmation and became an Episcopalian, and I've been one ever since. It's a bit random, but that's kind of how it worked for me, was just realizing that I needed a place where I could be in relationship with something bigger than myself, transcendence. And what really my faith then became formed around those 2 tables, the community meal table and the communion table. And those became the 2 centers of my faith. And I really can't think about faith or Christianity or make any sense of what I'm doing without those 2 locations.
Yeah, I think that that's very similar to how I feel, and maybe also connected to the household table too. But but those are kind of the central locations of faith for me too. And when you're blessed to be in a church where that connection is more explicit, it's a pretty great thing indeed, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. We would not exist. I mean, St. George Episcopal Church would not exist without those 2 tables.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, I'm also at a St. George's Anglican church, and we also have a very extensive feeding program. So I'm enjoying this connection that we have.
I remember one time telling an Orthodox priest that I think he was at St. George Monastery, and I told him that, that I was from St. George Episcopal Church, and he said, "Oh, St. George, very powerful, very powerful."
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I guess
that's my experience too. Okay, so we are going to talk in a moment about your role with the Christian Century, but how does that work as a writer and an editor? How does that link into your faith journey?
Yeah, so I've always been just one of those people that's pretty obsessed with religion, even in periods when I've not been very religious myself. I just have, I think one of my professors in graduate school just called it like a tuning. Like I just have an ear for religion, and I'm just really interested in how people express themselves religiously and what that means to them. And I'm fascinated by belief. And so when I was in graduate school, I studied readers of the Left Behind series. So that was my first academic project, was to study religious reading in relation to this kind of very popular novels that were everywhere at that time when I was in graduate school. Everybody was reading them. And so so I designed a kind of ethnographic project to ask people about their relationship to these novels and how they use them to construct truth, or if they used them to construct truth, what was fiction for them, what was truth, how do those categories work in their lives? And so, that was it was really talking to people pretty deeply about their faith and about their way of constructing religion, even though I didn't consider myself religious at the time, and I also didn't have very, very warm feelings about the kind of religion that they practiced or that they espoused. Our conversations were really deep and often really moving. And I think those conversations kind of moved me as well, so that I was ready for St. George Episcopal Church when it encountered me, when I encountered it. And so then I wrote a book about that. I wrote a book called Rapture Culture, and the Christian Century reviewed it. And so, and they did such a good job. It was this really in-depth review. It was written by Jason Biasi. It really seemed to grasp what I was doing at a level that no other reviewer had done. And so I just wrote to Jason. I just said, wow, that review was really beautiful and really seemed to get at what I wanted people to understand from this book. And at that point, he invited me to start writing for the Christian Century. So I started trying to think, well, like, what would I write about? What would be meaningful or interesting? So I started a little project where I interviewed people about, because interviewing seemed to be that was my sweet spot. And so I interviewed people about people who had converted from Protestantism to Orthodoxy. And I kind of traveled around the state of Colorado looking for those people and doing kind of in-depth interviews. And I wrote that up for the Christian Century, and that was the first story that I did for them. And I found that I just really enjoyed that process of getting to know people, asking questions, probing that, and then, but not spending years on it, just sort of compiling it and putting it out there in the world. I found that really worked for me as a practice, as a writing practice. And so I started writing fairly regularly for the magazine, and eventually was hired and eventually became an editor there. Really enjoying that process of condensing, compiling, and just really thinking about the core of things. How do you express what really needs to be expressed, and then get that to the audience?
So, okay, if I'm understanding right, like this was kind of also a parallel track where you kind of started in like a not particularly connected as a person of faith, and then the faith journey kind of unfolded as you were doing these feeding ministries and beginning to write for the Christian Century. Is that right?
I think that's a good way of, I think those things were unfolding together. I remember when I was hired at the Christian Century, I came out of Duke University, but not the religion department. I started in the religion department at Duke University, but pretty quickly I moved over to the literature program, which is a pretty radical program. It's rooted in Marxist thought. It's, Fred Jameson is kind of it was at one point the hotspot of postmodernism. And I remember when I was hired at the Christian Century, David Heim, who was the editor at the time, said, "Now, I just want you to understand that we are not interested in becoming post-Christian." And, I think that was a viable, it was a valuable thing for him to say to me. And I think he was, perceiving me in some ways correctly, that I wasn't sure how I was going to fit into this Christian part of the Christian Century, but that I knew I had an ear for religion. I knew I had an ear for religious stories, and I think he wanted to encourage me in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably pretty interesting to look at it all in the rearview mirror, and it looks like God had a pretty clear map for your life, but it probably didn't exactly feel like...
It didn't feel like that at all. No, it just felt like random stuff, like I need to be in this weird church, and I need to be eating this food, and I need to be connecting to these people. And then this other thing started to unfold, and And then they began to, like you said, grow together. That took a very long time, honestly, for my voice that I was using for the Christian Century to claim a Christian voice. That was a 8-year process, something like that. I mean, it was a long process.
Yeah, I mean, that's an encouragement, I think, to people on their faith journey to realize, like, it's not always the blink of an eye sort of Damascus moment, right?
Not for me.
God has a variety of timelines, I think. So over the course of those 23 years of starting that feeding program at St. George, have you seen a shift in what it meant to be a Christian in the past and what it means to be a Christian now?
For myself.
Well, or maybe just more
in the church.
Yeah, maybe just more general patterns.
St. George is such a weird animal that I don't, and it is the only church, that I've ever really been deeply a part of. And I feel like it's such a unicorn out there in the world. I have no idea if it maps at all onto anything that anybody else is doing. But I think we have become very comfortable with being a small, committed group of people connected to this larger work. And so we have probably 250 volunteers that work with our food, do the food work that we do. We call it sharing food. We have probably 250 volunteers that share food with us. We probably have we share food with probably 400 people, 450 people a week, something like that. And one shift that we've made over time is that we consider every single one of those people to be a participant, a full participant in our community. So we no longer think about, the people who are coming to church on Sunday, those are the real members and participants in the community. And then all these other people, this 400 people, those are like the interlopers or the pretend, whatever. We've just given up that distinction altogether. Every single one of those people, whether they come to church on Sunday, whether they're just there for one meal a week, whether they come by and grab a bag of food, whether they come by and unload a truck and move on their way, every single one of those people is a full-fledged member of our community. And keeping that mentality, then it shifts us from this idea that we've got to find more people who want to spend an hour every Sunday sitting in these pews and doing this ancient rite. There are those people. I'm one of those people. But that's not the end all be all of our existence as an organization. That's just this one weird thing that these small group of 10 people want to do. It's not that weird. I mean, it's Christianity, but I think in this community, Leadville is at 10,200 feet. It's a mountain town. The St. George has never, not since the 1930s, I think, has been bigger than 25.
Wow. Okay.
Members. It's been closed so many times over the 20th century that it's just a sort of a miracle that the building exists and that there are people in it. So I think because of that, it's always kind of had this outpost feel, this sort of, out on the margins of the culture doing sort of strange things. And so I know we've really cultivated that over the last 20 years, we're different, we're unusual, and we really put the food work at the center of all that we do.
Yeah. I mean, I think we sort of try to break down that charity model here in our feeding programs as well. And I think it transforms how you think about the church. But I think it's also becoming that partnership model is becoming more recognized in the charitable sector as well. That, rather than thinking about sort of the delivery of services to people who need them, that there is kind of more of a sense of building up community across people in different circumstances.
And
partnership. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep. We think of ourselves as having something to both to teach or challenge the church and something to teach or challenge the nonprofit sector. We live in that middle space between the two, but we feel that we have something to offer to both and to challenge both, because the church part of us really allows us to say, we're feeding every single person who walks through this door, no matter what. And we're not qualifying them. We are not asking them any questions. We are not trying to, do anything with their lives. We are just simply feeding everyone who walks through the door. And that comes out of our faith. That comes out of our grounded sense that God is in each single person who walks in this door, and that we are in search of the God in them. And that if we come in with our agenda and our certainty and our questions and we know it all or whatever, we're never gonna see that. We're never gonna find that image of Christ in that person. So that comes directly. And we've had, that's really been an interesting challenge in these last few years as COVID has really put people's attention on food insecurity, so that suddenly we're not doing this in the dark anymore. The county's interested in what we're doing and the city's interested in what we're doing. But they often have a very different set of demands that they really want to place on the people who come to the meals. So we have had to really get clear about, nope, it's every single person, and it's no matter what, and it's as long as we have food to share, we are sharing it. Period. End of story. And then on the nonprofit side, we feel like we are a challenge to the church in the sense that we do have this open door, this idea that we are all one. That if you come and get a bag of food, you're one with us. If you come and you sweep out the foyer on food pantry day, you're one of us. And so I feel like that's a challenge, to the church side, to kind of stop thinking in numbers and start thinking in human interaction and love and connection.
Yeah, I love that twofold challenge. And I would also add the word witness. Like, I think it's a witness to both of those sectors. So we've touched on your writing as a piece of that faith journey and roadmap of your life. Let's spend some time talking about the Christian Century. As we already mentioned, you are a senior editor at the Christian Century. Can you just flesh out for us a little bit who reads the Christian Century? What does your readership
the Christian
look
Century.
like?
So the Christian Century is also a very strange beast out there in the landscape of North American Christianity. So it was founded in the late 19th century. I think the century that they are referring to is the 20th century. So that's always been a bit of cumbersome name, which I think has been challenged by staff and board members and since maybe 1960. The first challenge to the name of like, could we change this name? Probably came around then. And we've continued to wrestle with it and struggle with it because it sounds, triumphalist in a way. Like, when was this Christian century?
Right.
And what are the hopes for it in the future? So, but anyway, it was founded as an ecumenical journal, so that the seven sister churches of Protestantism, which we don't really talk about anymore, if you challenged me, I'm not sure I could come up with all seven of them, but there were seven, and I'm sure listeners know what those seven were. But they were Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Lutherans, Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ, and one other, and I'm sorry I missed you. Whoever you are, you're very important.
Methodist?
And I got the Methodists.
I got them.
Anyway.
Okay.
Should have written those down ahead of time. Anyway, those seven churches founded this journal together in the sense that they really wanted it to be independent. They didn't want it to belong to any one of them, and to have the voice be independent. It was a socially progressive magazine. It was rooted in the social gospel movement of the late 19th and early 20th century. And so it's very interesting to be working for a magazine that is, over 100 years old. And whenever anything comes up, you can always ask, like, well, what were we thinking 100 years ago about this? And that's both, good and bad. Sometimes it's terrifying. And you can also learn a lot from the mistakes of the past, learn a lot from the way that previous editors made sense of their culture and their century and so on. And these days, it's read by a very broad and diverse audience, but primarily they are clergy or religious leaders.
Okay.
So it's not a leadership journal per se. It sees itself as being a much broader project beyond just clergy and would appeal to, interested lay people. But it exists at this juncture between the church and the academy. So in some ways, it's very academic in nature, and it assumes a reader who's pretty well educated.
Right. And
on the other side, it's very church oriented, and it assumes a leader who's pretty interested in the dynamics of everyday life in the church. So it straddles those two worlds, and we don't do anything that would be, overtly academic in nature, but we're always trying to ask a critical question that a leader who's been trained in the academy would find to be an interesting and profound question. We're always probing for that. We want our readers to be awakened by what they read in the magazine, to be enlivened by it, to have their questions, and never to read anything that they're like. I mean, of course, everybody has different opinions about what goes in there, but it should never be dumb.
Yeah.
Should always give you something to think about.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, that's exactly why I invited you to be on the Future Christian podcast with me. I subscribe to Christian Century, and I write for Christian Century on occasion. And this is a podcast about the church and how it's structured and led, and how we encourage and equip church leaders. And as I was thinking through who I wanted to talk to about that, I thought it would be really interesting to hear from your perspective what you try to look for in terms of stories that are going to challenge, equip, encourage church leaders. Like
we cast a very broad net for that. We're always looking for something that would probably surprise you to find in our pages. Something that's just like, whoa, what? Like, so for example, in the most recent issue coming up, we have a piece on this haiku priest poet he died, I can't remember when he died, but he's several decades ago he died. His name is Raymond Rosaleep. And when we read his haiku and someone sent us this piece about his haiku, we were all so blown away by how beautiful it was and how strange. And he kind of used the form of haiku to talk about Christian theology and to ponder it and to give people kind of startling images in relation to it. And so we were just absolutely blown away by it. Now, could we have predicted that we would publish a piece about a haiku poet who died several years ago and was also a priest? Probably not. We wouldn't have put that on a calendar, like, oh, okay, let's go find the haiku poet priest article. But that's what is fun about the work, is that we're always looking for those little oddities that really, when you encounter them, they're so surprising and enlivening. We just did a piece on, I'm obviously interested in the literature end of things, so probably all my examples are going to be obscure literary examples, but we just did a beautiful piece on Denise Levertov and how she used poetry to explore the possibility of faith and what that meant for her, and that was a beautiful piece. Another really, really important part of what we do are books.
Right.
People love to read the Christian Century to find books, and they should, because we really, there are so few places these days that do the kinds of extensive book reviews and the kind of extensive book reading that we do to put out the magazine. So I think that's another really important part of what we do that seems sort of weird and like, who in the 21st century would be like, yeah, books. That's the thing. But for the Christian Century, it is. People who read the Christian Century love books. Editors love books. We spend a lot of time thinking about books. We spend a lot of time talking about books and reviewing them and all of those things. And it's just an enormous part of what we do. And I think it's really gratifying to be in a place that loves books so much.
Yeah. And, I'm sure that I speak for the majority of the readers of Christian Century in saying that as a church leader, you want to have your critical thinking and your imaginative thinking stimulated on a regular basis in order to do what we do. So I think that's an interesting angle into some of the stories that you look for. It's not sort of all about, okay, we'll follow these 10 steps for, getting more people in your pews or whatever. Like that's
right.
You're not kind of looking for the technical stories around congregational development per se. Like,
right. If somebody had a really interesting idea about how to approach that would really, shock readers or surprise them, I think we would absolutely do it. We're not opposed, but it's hard to find those things, right? Because some ways you and I could sit down here, and I'm not even a pastor, and I could sit down and come up with the 10 whatevers. It's just not, it just doesn't really fill people with hope or enliven them or even encourage them. It just kind of like, oh, okay, there's a to-do list, right? Like, and then you just say, oh, am I doing it right? Am I doing it wrong? So we think of ourselves, we think of ourselves as kind of opening up the landscape of this kind of Christian leadership, Christian living.
mm-hmm.
I already said the word landscape. Okay, so anyway, opening that landscape up, and then just wandering around in it and wondering about things, and then somebody. The Christian Century won Associated Church Press Award some years ago for being the best magazine in the church world, and we've won several of those. So that isn't about the award, but this is about the fact that one of the judges said, "The thing I most love about the Christian Century is that you want to spend time with it." She said, what you should do to read the Christian Century is sit down, pour yourself a glass of wine, and just enjoy it. And I think that, to me, that really spoke to what it is we're trying to do. You should be able to really enjoy it and savor it and not get stuck in your head and not add a whole bunch of things to your to-do list. Usually I add books that I want to read to my list when I read the Christian Century. But yeah, it's that pleasure. Right now, especially, we've just gone through a major what's that called? Can't think of the word. It's been a long day. We just remade the magazine. We redesigned. We just redesigned the magazine. Yeah. And it's gorgeous. It's got gorgeous art. We increased our art budget. It's got beautiful illustrations, original illustrations, lots of original art in there. It's absolutely beautiful. And I think that was our intention, was to really double down on print, really double down on beauty, and give and just feed pastors' souls, just feed them with good stuff. There's lots of poetry in the magazine. We're often just trying to give the pastor a moment of richness that I think really feeds their work.
Well, that's kind of another table in your life then, another place of feeding.
Yeah, it is.
And gathering. Yeah. I just wrote down a bunch of the words that you said because I think they're great. Hope, joy, encouragement, wonder, enliven, savor, beauty. I mean, what a great mandate.
Yeah, that's what we're after.
That's awesome.
That's what we're after. Absolutely.
So I would say that, like, with the online aspect of publication these days, that you're able to put together some different metrics around what generates the most eyeballs, the most engagement, the most conversation. I know that at least in some past years that you've published a list at the end of the year of like most read articles. What do you see being the topics that generate the most conversation and engagement?
I mean, absolutely, our readers are hungry for theology. And almost anything, we did a piece on atonement. Yeah. And
well, I wrote one piece about atonement a few years ago, but I think you have one.
That's what I'm thinking. I was like,
recent.
I think maybe it was your piece. It might have been your piece on atonement, but it would be a good example. I was like, all of a sudden, I'm like, wait, that was Martha's piece. That's a good example of the kind of stuff our readers are hungry for, and that they pass around and that they talk about and that they exchange. I mean, how strange is that? But when you look at the list of, the most read articles in the Christian Century from the past year, they're all theology related. They are church-related, church practice, or that kind of thing. Pastoral care is a really important subject to a lot of our readers. And those are the kinds of things that get a lot of attention or engagement. Now, because we've really put our money on print and we've really doubled down on print, we don't necessarily know what is most engaging to our readers. That in the analytics that we get on the kind of data analytics that we run for social media don't necessarily tell us everything we want to know about sort of how readers read the magazine. But, it does give us something, and it tells us that our readers are very interested in theology and they're very interested in church, and that's probably no surprise.
Yeah. Have you seen a shift at all in the kinds of topics that you cover, or, what people are talking about the most? Like, has that, did it change over the course of the pandemic? Do you see,
gosh, good question.
Particular like pockets of anxiety around things? Like what?
I know that we have as an organization in the past 5 years really, really, really put a lot of emphasis on finding more diverse writers for the magazine, and also interrogating and understanding how the century has dealt with race and race in our culture and race in society. And so I think that there has been a shift, and readers are very interested in that, and so are our writers. So we tend to get a lot of articles submitted about race and racial dynamics, and about grappling with racial structures and structural racism in our society and so on. We're very attentive to that, and we really want to grow as an organization in our understanding and help our readers also to navigate. And I think that's new. I think it's not new in American culture, but it's new for a focus or an emphasis on behalf of the magazine to really help our readers navigate some new landscapes culturally. And I think our readers are very engaged with those kinds of questions. They're very interested. And so we saw, of course, during the pandemic, we saw a huge increase in the need for articles about worship, articles about engagement, articles about how do we navigate this pandemic together. Like, there was a lot of need for that. And with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, there was a lot of need for grappling with these questions at a social level. Who are we? What are we doing together? How do we live? How do we create the society that we want to live in? And that kind of thing. So the Christian Century, I usually mention this, and I would have mentioned it earlier in my intro to the magazine, but it was the place where Martin Luther King published Letter from a Birmingham Jail.
Oh my gosh.
It was the first place that he used the pages of the Christian Century to get that message out. And that makes a lot of sense, because it really was a place where social justice issues were being addressed, and a place where readers needed to be pushed. And I think that is still very much the case, and we're still very much interested in doing those two things.
Yeah, that is quite a legacy to have that as part of the history of your magazine, and at the same time,
it really challenges you to be like, okay, live up to that.
Yeah, it sets a pretty high bar. And also, I mean, what you sort of said about the conversations that have been unfolding, particularly in the last couple of years around racial justice and the pandemic, that very much tracks with my experience of how the church conversations have changed as well. So obviously the Christian Century is very tuned into what people are talking about and what they need, which is
And I think another
important.
huge shift in emphasis for us has been ecological.
Yeah.
And really being able to find, I remember talking about this at the Christian Century, 15 years ago, but not really knowing or being able to action it, to really create a breakthrough in the conversation. We really would get stuck a lot of times with, everybody knows the climate is changing. Everybody knows that there are these people who don't think the climate is changing. And it was really hard to find out where the edge was in that conversation. And I remember doing an interview with this amazing woman, Catherine Hayhoe, who has really made it her life's work to talk with climate deniers about their climate denial. And then that was fascinating. So we began to find little inroads, ways to talk about. And it's interesting when you start building those kinds of conversations, they grow. You feed the soil, you look for writers, you ask questions, and then you begin to see how the conversation develops or grows. And I think that the environmental conversation is another one that we've cultivated in recent years and has grown.
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear. Now, we have the connection around Christian Century, and that was my primary reason for reaching out to you for today's conversation. But you are also a podcast host, and your second season of episodes came out over the course of the last year, and
2023.
2023. Yep. And that season was focused on the topic In Search of Truth. You have a third season in the works. Is that right?
Yeah, I haven't actually done an interview yet, but I've started to develop the ideas and started to send some emails, and we'll see.
Okay. All right. So it's not, the episodes aren't quite in the hopper yet.
No, my plan is to launch the third season of In Search of on February 15th. I think Ash Wednesday, which I've launched each season of the podcast on Ash Wednesday.
Oh.
And then run it for 8 weeks. So for me, it just kind of makes I think it's a good Lenten theme, because all of the podcasts are about searching. They're about people who are on a search. They're about weird sorts of finding. And so that's kind of the big project as a whole. Has been about searching.
Yeah. That sounds like a great Lenten journey and focus. I really firmly believe that podcasting is such an asset to the life of Christian leadership these days, because I think we just need tons of honest conversation, and we need tons of space for engaging different voices and having people really sit down together and talk across difference and find common ground, and take an idea and then unpack it in a deeper way and just keep the conversation going. What was your motivation for getting into podcasting as a part of what you do at Christian Century?
I did want a new challenge. I mean, that's part of it. I have been at the Christian Century for some time now, and I was interested in a new challenge, and we really hadn't ventured in this direction as an organization. We had hosted a couple of podcasts that we don't get involved in the content at all, but we hadn't really ourselves thought about podcasting. And so that was the first thing, was just like, oh, this is an experiment. Let's see, what am I interested in? And I had just written this book called Wild Woman, which was about my search for Mary of Egypt, who is a 5th century saint of the desert. And I had gone on this journey, literal journey, in search of her, looking for evidence of her in the landscape of Egypt, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. And so I kind of traced her life through the desert. And so I'd learned a lot, and I'd met a lot of really amazing people, and I had, it just had been an incredible exploration, but also something that was really deep around searching itself, that searching was a profound spiritual practice, and that when you do it, you may or may not find, but you certainly, it's a deepening experience. And I learned that this is a quote from Rainer Maria Rilke, but I learned that I am one who likes to search for things. And so, I don't necessarily find them, but I really love to search for them. So that became the core of the idea, is searching itself as an interesting thing to pay attention to. And the first season was really delightful, because I sort of explored the idea of searching in that first season, and also explored some of the fascinating things that I had learned from my time in the desert. So this great interview with this ethnobotanist who I was like, what do the desert saints eat in the desert? And so he talked to me about desert plants, and he talked to me about water collection, talked to me about all kinds of things. And he also is just a super interesting guy. His name is Gary Nobhan, and he's written dozens of books on plants and the Sonoran Desert and the deserts of the Middle East. And he's really and food, and he's just an amazing guy. So that was the kind of thing I was exploring in that first season. And then the second season, I just wanted a little bit of more of a target, because this felt kind of random. And so I decided that we would go on a search for truth. And I also felt like, as a society, truth is becoming such a problematic area for us. Most of us, we're not sure if we believe that it exists, but we also are seeing more and more how desperately we need it, and how if we say that it doesn't exist, or your truth is different from my truth, or whatever, we can diverge as a society and divide and become impossible it becomes impossible for us to live with one another when we're carrying around these different ideas about truth. And so I was fascinated by the question of truth, and I decided to explore it in different fields and to see sort of, what does truth look like in biblical studies? What does truth look like in physics? What does truth look like in social justice? What is truth? And so those were sort of how I laid out the episodes. So each episode deals with truth in journalism, truth in interreligious dialogue. How do you begin to address the question of truth in interreligious dialogue? So that was the second season.
I really appreciate that naming of the search as being very integral to the life of faith. We have this beautiful prayer in at the time of baptism. We pray for the candidate being baptized to have an inquiring and discerning heart, and the courage to will and to persevere, and a spirit of joy and wonder in all of God's works. And I think you could easily slot the word search into that prayer and say, like, yeah, this is baked into the baptismal life.
Right. Yeah. It's absolutely integral to our spiritual growth, to our development, to our relationship with God. If we're not in search of a relationship, then, I think we begin to sort of die inside.
Yeah.
And church practices don't always lead to that kind of inquiry or self-inquiry or growth. But, at the end of the day, I think I'm in search of both God and myself when I go on these journeys.
Yeah, and I think it's integral to our relationship with one another and our life as the church too, that we keep track of the fact that we're not done deals. We're not finished products. Like, God isn't finished with us yet. We can be sort of active agents in making sure that we're on that journey of process with God.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I just wanted to celebrate that a little bit, and celebrate it in as many different ways as I could.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm intrigued by the third season coming up, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk again across podcasts.
Oh, that'd be great.
When that comes out.
That would be so fun.
That would be a lot of fun. Okay, well, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back in a few moments for some closing questions. And we are back for our closing questions. Now, Amy, we always tell our guests this reminder, these closing questions, you can take as seriously or as not seriously as you want. So the choice is up to you. If you were Pope for one day, what would that day look like?
Well, obviously there would be a lot of food and a lot of
some tables,
drink, and there'd be lots of tables, and people would gather around them. And for a day, we would definitely give up some of the arcane procedures, let's call them, that have gathered around the Eucharist, and we would celebrate together, I think, the life of the full life of being the body of Christ. So if I got to be Pope for a day, we would just let it all go and break bread together and feast together. But I definitely would try to, but since I have a whole day, I would also try to address, I think, the clergy crises that we are in. And I think that the Pope would be a great place to start, where starting with, unmarried priests. I think I would just be done with that, and we'd be done with that. Now, of course, if there's a priest who doesn't want to get married, that's fine. It wouldn't be forced on anyone. Marriage is not that great. I wouldn't force it on anyone. But still, we would just let that go. That was a tradition, didn't work, created some real divisions and some real pain and real suffering in our societies. So we're done with it. And The same thing with all the problems that we have with homosexuality and the priesthood and homosexual inclusion in our society. Just let all that go. And since I got to be Pope for the day, we would just move to full inclusion all across the board and just be done with this conversation that has not served the purpose of love. And
Well,
that's what I do.
You had me at food, so
yeah, exactly.
I'm on board with you being Pope
there
for the day.
Oh, great. We'll see if you can get anybody else on board with that idea.
Yeah, the rest of the agenda sounds really good too. What theologian or historical Christian figure would you want to meet or bring back to life?
Or right now, I am 100% fascinated by this woman named Maria Skobtsova, who lived in the 20th century, and she was a Bolshevik during the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and then she became a refugee. She fled Russia during the Russian Revolution and ended up in Paris. And in Paris, she started these hospitality houses where they were predominantly for women, Russian refugee women at the time. So she just convinced the diocese to open up these houses. She convinced them to buy the houses and open them, and she would organize the women to be able to live there. And then every day she would go to the market and she would take all the stuff that the marketers were throwing away, and she would bring that back and create lunch. And she would invite all of the Russian emigre society. So the thinkers and the poets and the philosophers, they would all come and have lunch with the refugee women, and they would sit around this big table and eat soup. And there was a Polish bread baker who was really into baking bread for this group. So there would be bread and there would be soup. And she did that for several years. And then when the Nazis took over Paris, she turned those hospitality houses into refugee houses for Jewish refugees. And she was arrested while she was doing that work and was executed by the Nazis. But I'm really fascinated by her story and by the way that she used this kind of spontaneous hospitality to address the questions of her day. She's also a beautiful poet. She wrote really stunning essays that were very challenging to the church of her moment. And so it's that combination, of course, it's a combination that I'm so fascinated by, but the combination of food and writing and then this kind of intellectual atmosphere that she cultivated and this all are one at one table sort of thing that she just really draws my attention. I would love to sit down with her and just have some soup.
She sounds like your kind of people.
She sounds like my people.
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
She's pretty cool.
What will history remember from our current time and place?
I'm not very good on this question, I don't think, because what is our current time and place? When does it start? When does it end? What is the era we're living in? It's so hard to know. But I think some of the things that strike me is that, if we don't address the climate crisis, of course, history won't remember this time in this place. And so we'll either be remembered for getting it and figuring it out, or we'll be remembered for failing to get it and to figure it out. And we'll be remembered regardless for how we responded, for how we met the moment. And there's just kind of no getting around that, that's where we are and where our planet is going. And every day teaches us that again and again and again.
Yeah, when you put it like that, it's pretty hard to argue against that. That is true, for better or for worse.
And I think, that challenge, that's a real challenge to our churches, because I think I read a statistic, something like 1 in every 4 people in the United States has been impacted by a climate crisis, a climate-related crisis. 1 in 4. So we think of ourselves as being like somehow we've kind of we've lucked out or whatever. It's facing us now. It's not somebody else's problem. So the churches are, we're going to be called upon to respond. And, we should probably be ready, because it's gonna hit us pretty hard.
Yeah, it is hitting us pretty hard. You're right.
It is hitting us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that might lead right into this last question. What are your hopes for the future of Christianity?
I'm so ready for Christianity. And I can't speak about world Christianity, so I'm just going to speak about North American Christianity. But I'm very ready for North American Christianity to set down the idea of attraction. That this consumer-oriented relationship to the church that we just seem to be so convinced by and addicted to. I'm just so ready for us to accept that Christianity is fundamentally a critique of society, and that we're always going to be, if we're doing anything right, we're going to be outside of it. We're going to be outside of the culture. We're not going to be, it. We're not going to be it, If there was a moment, and it was 1950, when all of a sudden every Christianity in North America exploded and everybody wanted to be a Christian and everybody went to a Christian church, that wasn't Christianity.
Right.
Christianity is the critique of that for me, And so I'm ready for us to accept that the Christianity of the future is small, that it's poor, and that it is doing the work of feeding people, healing people, meeting them where they are. I'm just ready for that. I'm just ready for every church in America to just give up the story and just go and, sit down with some people and have some food and call it good.
Yeah, that's a pretty good bookend to our conversation. I feel like we started with tables and we're ending with tables, and it's been a good conversation in between. So thank you, Amy. Where can people find out more about you? And you did mention your most recent book, but if you can highlight that for us again, and where to go.
Absolutely. So all my books, you can find all my books at amyfrykholm.com. And obviously they're available in any bookstore or online bookstore. And you could also find me at the Christian Century. And we'd love to see you there.
And can you just tell us the title of your most recent book again?
Oh, my most recent book is called Wild Woman. I'm going to come up with let me try that again. My most recent book is called Wild Woman, A Footnote, The Desert, and My Search for an Elusive Saint.
Okay, that's a pretty good title to inspire us for some more searching. So thank you. Thank you so much for this time today.
Thank you, Martha. Thanks so much for having me. It's delightful to get to know you a little bit.
We always end with a word of peace. So the peace of God be with you, Amy.
And also with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.